At 22 years old, he cruised through life in a matte black Porsche purchased with his father's fortune, convinced that the black belt tied around his waist had transformed him into something dangerous. One humid afternoon, he trapped me beside the catering tent, rolling his shoulders and cracking his knuckles while a circle of wealthy friends gathered to watch. In his mind, humiliating the quiet middle-aged chauffeur would prove he was the toughest man there. What he never realized was that I had already 12 years in the Navy SEALs. To me, violence had never been a competition. It had simply been another language. The armored Mercedes Maybach belonging to Richard Cole always carried the same scent. Premium cologne blended with filtered air that never quite felt real. I rested behind the steering wheel while rain slid down the dark-tinted windows and the engine hummed with barely audible precision. Officially, my title was Executive Protection and Logistics. In practice, I drove one of the richest men in the country wherever he wanted to go. Richard Cole had built a fortune buying dying industrial businesses, stripping them apart, and selling every valuable piece. Profit was the only lens through which he viewed the world. Every person fit neatly into one of three categories: a tool, a problem, or an audience. My role was obvious. I was the silent tool that made him feel safe. Jack, his voice arrived through the rear seat intercom, clipped and impatient. "Yes, Mr. Cole. We're going to miss the merger dinner." "I'll get us there." The interstate had become a parking lot after a major accident locked every lane ahead. I eased the heavy sedan toward a shrinking opening between a taxi and a delivery truck. Slipping through with barely an inch to spare, the engine never surged, the passengers never lurched. That was intentional. Smooth driving meant people forgot you existed. Being forgotten suited me just fine. 5 years earlier, nobody could have called me invisible. Back then, I was leading a 6-man SEAL element through the dust-filled corridors of a compound in Helmand Province. Night vision goggles painted the world in harsh shades of green, while my suppressed MK-18 rested against my shoulder, ready for the next doorway. 12 years in the teams had left permanent reminders, a knee that never completely healed, constant ringing in my left ear, and something heavier than either of those. Silence, not ordinary silence, the kind that settles inside a person after years spent balancing between life and death, only to return home where people scream over spilled coffee or traffic lights. Civilian life often felt louder than combat. I accepted Richard Cole's offer because it paid nearly 3 times more than any private security company. Money mattered. My daughter Sarah lived with her mother in Connecticut. She had been born with a congenital heart condition. Most of the surgeries were already behind her, but specialized rehabilitation and medications insurance refused to fully cover, continued to drain every dollar I earned. Richard's paycheck kept those treatments going. For Sarah, I could tolerate the cheap black suit. I could ignore the disrespect. I could disappear. We returned to the Cole estate in Greenwich shortly after 10 that evening. The mansion stretched across the property like a monument to excess, wrapped in towering glass walls and imported Italian stone. As I opened the rear passenger door, the entrance to the house swung open. Tyler Cole strode outside. At 22, he carried his father's sharp features, but none of his discipline. Where Richard possessed calculated restraint, Tyler lived on unchecked confidence. Whores with private trainers had built an impressive frame. Years without consequences had built an even bigger ego. He wore custom fight shorts and a fitted rash guard, sweat still clinging to his skin as he bounced lightly on the balls of his feet. "Dad," he called, barely acknowledging my existence. "You should have seen today." I tapped my striking coach 3 times. Guy couldn't keep up once it hit the ground. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a rare gesture. "Good," he replied. "Keep training. Discipline matters." Tyler's attention drifted toward me. His eyes scanned my frame from head to toe. I stood 6'2" and weighed just over 200 pounds, but years of carrying overloaded rucksacks through mountains had built a different kind of strength than gyms produced. It wasn't flashy. It didn't stretch the seams of tailored clothing. It simply existed, yet reliable. "Hey, driver," Tyler said. He never used my name, only driver. "You look stiff. You ought to train with me sometime. Might loosen up those old joints." The grin on his face invited laughter more than conversation. "Thanks," I answered evenly. "I'm doing just fine." He shrugged. "Suit yourself. Wouldn't want you throwing your back out carrying groceries." He laughed at his own joke before following his father toward the front doors. I remained alone in the driveway as the rain finally stopped. The humid night settled over the property. My thumb rubbed unconsciously across the thick callus on my knuckle. Easy, I reminded myself. Sarah, the mortgage, the medical bills, just breathe. I parked the Maybach inside the garage, but the familiar instinct buried deep inside me briefly stirred awake. For a split second, the peaceful estate transformed into lines of approach, blind corners, escape routes, and potential threats. Old habits. I forced them back into the darkness where they belonged. Over the next 3 months, martial arts stopped being Tyler's hobby and became his entire personality. Passing his black belt examination at an upscale MMA academy convinced him he had become something exceptional. From that moment forward, the people working around the estate became little more than props in his performance. He deliberately blocked hallways so housekeepers had to squeeze around him. He turned handshakes with gardeners into contests of strength. Eventually, his attention settled on me. From that point on, the harassment came in small doses, never enough to draw attention, always enough to send a message. I'd head through the kitchen to collect the vehicle keys, and Tyler would accidentally slam his shoulder into mine while walking past. The first time it happened, years of conditioning took over before conscious thought ever could. My weight settled instantly. One foot shifted back a fraction. Every muscle through my forearms tightened. I never raised my hands. I didn't have to. The impact barely moved me. Tyler, on the other hand, staggered a half step before catching himself. Annoyance flashed across his face. "Watch where you're going, old man." "Excuse me," I answered calmly. Letting the tension drain from my body, he rolled his eyes and continued down the hallway. He had absolutely no idea how close he had come to waking up on the floor with a separated shoulder. Combat inside the teams was nothing like what happened in commercial gyms. There were no referees, no points, no applause. The objective wasn't to win. The objective was to eliminate a lethal threat in seconds and keep moving, break the joint, destroy the airway, neutralize the danger. Quick, efficient, permanent. I inhaled slowly until the adrenaline faded, leaving behind the familiar metallic taste that always followed a near reaction. A week later, I stood beside the Maybach checking my phone. A message from my ex-wife had just arrived. Sarah's therapist said she'd nearly completed an entire mile without losing her breath. I smiled before I could stop myself. "Who are you texting?" Tyler's voice cut through the quiet. "Your retirement club?" He walked across the driveway with 2 friends trailing behind him. Both wore expensive athletic gear and carried matching gym bags, looking like copies of the same catalog model. I slipped my phone into my pocket. "Just family. My dad leaves in 10 minutes, I added. "Relax," Tyler replied, then he turned toward his friends. "This is the driver I was telling you about." He jabbed a thumb toward me. "Looks tough, doesn't he? Stands around like some action movie bodyguard." One of the young men laughed. "He looks like he needs physical therapy." The 3 of them found that hilarious. Tyler stepped forward until barely a foot separated us. Classic intimidation: crowd the space. Force the other person backward, make them surrender ground. I didn't move, not an inch. I simply looked at him. His eyes carried the redness of someone fueled by too much pre-workout. Expensive cologne couldn't quite hide it. This time he used my name. "Ever actually been in a fight, Jack? Or do you just stand there trying to scare photographers?" "I don't enjoy fighting, Tyler." That wasn't diplomacy, it was the truth. I'd seen enough broken bodies to last several lifetimes. He laughed loudly and looked back toward his friends. "Told you, guys like this always pretend they're dangerous." He flexed his shoulders. "I could fold you up in 10 seconds, I'm sure you believe that." I kept every trace of emotion out of my voice. "If you'll excuse me, I need to clean the windshield before your father comes out." Turning your back on an aggressive person is normally a mistake. This time it was deliberate. Sometimes walking away is the strongest way to end a confrontation. As I reached the front of the Maybach, I heard him mutter loud enough for everyone to hear. "Quard." The word landed harder than it should have. For an instant the driveway disappeared, dust filled the air, rotor blades pounded overhead. Miller lay bleeding in my arms while we waited for evacuation. Copper dirt smoke. I squeezed the microfiber towel until my knuckles whitened. Sarah, think about Sarah. I focused on the windshield until every memory settled back where it belonged. August arrived wrapped in suffocating heat. Richard Cole's annual corporate retreat took over his Hamptons estate, drawing executives, investors, politicians, and the kind of glamorous guests who always seemed to appear wherever billionaires gathered. My assignment remained simple: Coordinate arrivals watch the perimeter. Keep intoxicated VIPs from creating expensive problems. Tyler, meanwhile, had transformed one side of the sprawling backyard into his personal arena. Heavy foam mats covered the grass beside the swimming pool. He and several friends spent the afternoon grappling, sparring, and showing off while executives watched with cocktails in hand, amused by the spectacle. I stayed near the catering area beneath the shade, drinking cold water and keeping my attention on the entrance gates. Jack. Richard's voice carried over the music. I turned. He stood beside the mats holding a martini. Tyler occupied the center, breathing hard after submitting another training partner. Adrenaline radiated from him. So did the attention he clearly enjoyed. I walked over. "Yes, Mr. Cole?" Richard gestured casually toward his son. "Tyler says everybody here is too easy." He chuckled proudly. "I figured we've got a strong security man standing right here." He smiled. "Give him a workout, a few rounds." My eyes shifted from Richard to Tyler. Tyler slapped his padded gloves together. "Come on, Jack." He raised his voice so everyone nearby could hear. "Let's see if you've actually got anything. Or are you worried about wrinkling that suit?" Laughter spread through the crowd. People leaned closer. Affluent spectators love competition, especially when someone else pays the price. "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole," I said quietly. "I'm working. It wouldn't be appropriate." His smile disappeared. "I decide what's appropriate." His tone hardened. "Take the jacket off. I'll add $5,000 to your next paycheck. Let him demonstrate what I've been paying his instructors to teach him." $5,000. 3 months of Sarah's therapy. I looked across the mats. Tyler wasn't searching for competition. He wanted an audience. He wanted to embarrass the hired help in front of his father. Lowering my voice, I spoke so only Richard could hear. "Sir, you truly don't want me to do this?" His expression darkened. "Are you refusing me?" The meaning behind the question was obvious. Refuse and the paycheck disappears. So does the health insurance. So does Sarah's treatment. Without another word, I unbuttoned my jacket. Cheers erupted around the mat. Tyler's friends celebrated before anything had even begun. I folded the jacket carefully onto a nearby lounge chair. The tie came next. Then I rolled my sleeves above my elbows. The afternoon heat pressed down like a blanket. Still wearing my slacks and dress shoes, I stepped onto the mat. Tyler laughed. "Take the shoes off, driver." "I don't want you ruining my mats." I ignored him completely. Instead, I walked to the center and stopped. No fighting stance, no raised fists. No theatrics, just relaxed shoulders, balanced feet, steady breathing. Tyler bounced lightly across from me, tapping his gloves together. "Submission rules," he announced confidently. "No punches to the face. You ready?" I met his eyes. "Whenever you are." Exploded forward without another word. For all his arrogance, he was undeniably quick. Endless hours on padded floors had sharpened his timing, when his body reacted with the confidence of someone who had succeeded hundreds of times inside a controlled environment. He lowered his level and drove in for a textbook double-leg takedown, aiming to wrap both arms around my legs before lifting me off the ground. Technically, it was clean, efficient, exactly the way he'd been taught. From where I stood, it unfolded in slow motion. Locked. Years spent clearing hostile buildings changed the way the mind processes movement. When survival depends on recognizing danger a split second before everyone else, time begins to stretch. As Tyler committed his weight forward, I didn't retreat. I simply wasn't there anymore. My left foot pivoted, my hips rotated just enough to slide off his line of attack. His shoulder, intended to crash into my center, met empty space instead. Momentum became his enemy. He stumbled past me. Fighting to recover his balance, I rested one hand lightly against the back of his neck while the other settled near his hip. There was no shove, no burst of strength. I merely redirected the force he had already created. Gravity finished the rest. He hit the mat face first with a heavy thump. Silence swallowed the backyard. Every conversation stopped. Every drink froze halfway to someone's mouth. Tyler pushed himself up almost instantly. His face burned crimson. Embarrassment had replaced confidence in a single heartbeat. He glared at me. Lucky move. The grin was gone. Only anger remained. He charged again. This time, he abandoned the takedown entirely. His right hand whipped toward my head in a wide looping hook, ignoring the rules he had announced only moments earlier. I didn't step away. I stepped inside. Before the punch reached full extension, my forearm intercepted his upper arm, redirecting the strike before it carried any real power. At the same moment, my right leg slipped behind his lead foot. I never threw a punch, There was no need. Leverage did all the work. His balance disappeared. For the briefest instant his feet left the mat before his back slammed onto the foam with enough force to empty the air from his lungs. A harsh gasp escaped him. He lay staring upward, struggling to remember how breathing worked. I remained standing over him. My pulse hadn't changed. My breathing stayed slow and controlled. Not a drop of sweat touched my forehead. "Are we finished, Tyler?" My voice never rose above normal conversation. He stared at me. For a second, I thought the lesson had landed. It hadn't. Humiliation burned hotter than reason. He rolled onto his feet, still gasping for air, fury replacing whatever discipline his instructors had tried to teach him. Training vanished. Emotion took over. He rushed straight at me. No technique, no plan. Only rage. Both hands seized the front of my dress shirt, trying to drag me into a clinch the instant his fingers locked onto the fabric. Something changed. It wasn't a conscious choice. It never was. Years of repetition buried deep beneath civilian life surfaced all at once. The driver disappeared. The operator returned. My body moved before thought had time to catch up. My right arm threaded over his, trapping one of his arms tightly against his own chest. My left hand secured control above his elbow. I dropped my hips and rotated. His posture collapsed instantly. As he stumbled forward, I stepped behind his legs and redirected his weight. We hit the ground together. Only I wasn't underneath him. I landed beside him. One knee settled firmly against his ribs, applying just enough pressure to immobilize him without causing unnecessary injury. My left arm circled his neck, not an air choke. Blood choke. My forearm compressed the artery with precise pressure. Less than a second had passed from the moment he grabbed my shirt. Now he couldn't move. The entire lawn had fallen silent. No laughter, no cheering, no applause. Only stunned disbelief. Tyler thrashed desperately beneath me. His hands clawed at my arm, searching for leverage that wasn't there. As panic set in, every movement became more frantic. I leaned closer until my mouth was only inches from his ear. When I spoke, the polite chauffeur's voice was gone. The words came out low, calm, and unmistakably cold. "Listen carefully. You train in a gym, you wear a belt, you practice on padded floors, you stop when someone taps." I paused just long enough for him to hear every heartbeat. Where I learned there are no mats, there is no referee, and nobody gets to quit. His eyes widened. Real fear replaced anger. "I'll let you go. When I do, you stay exactly where you are until I walk away. Do you understand?" He nodded as fast as he could. I released the choke immediately. In one smooth motion I stood, adjusted my sleeves, and stepped away. Behind me, Tyler rolled onto his side, coughing violently as he fought to fill his lungs. I never looked back. Instead, I faced the crowd, executives, investors, politicians, guests who had arrived expecting harmless entertainment. Now every one of them stared at me as though they were seeing a stranger, not a driver, not hired security. Something else entirely. My eyes settled on Richard Cole. His face had drained of color. The martini glass in his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. For the first time since I'd taken the job, he understood who had been driving him every day. I walked calmly to the lounge chair where my jacket rested. I picked it up, slipped one arm through the sleeve, then looked toward Richard. "I'll expect that bonus on my next paycheck, Mr. Cole." My voice carried clearly across the silent lawn. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked toward the driveway. No one tried to stop me. No one said a word. The only sound left behind was Tyler struggling to breathe as the illusion he'd spent years building collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. Monday morning arrived beneath damp skies and the smell of fresh rain rising from the pavement. I was already beside the Maybach when Richard Cole stepped through the front doors at exactly 7:30. Normally, he kept everyone waiting. Assistants rushed after him. Phones rang nonstop. Oars flew in every direction. That morning was different. He walked alone, no phone in his hand, no conversation, no impatience. Just a long, unreadable stare fixed on me. I opened the rear door. "Good morning, Mr. Cole." Without answering, he climbed into the back seat. I closed the door, circled the vehicle, and pulled away from the estate. The drive remained silent. Mile after mile passed before either of us spoke. Usually, the rear cabin functioned like a mobile boardroom. Richards spent the commute threatening lawsuits, negotiating acquisitions, or dismantling someone else's career over conference calls. Today, the privacy divider stayed lowered. He simply watched the trees slide past the window. After several minutes, I broke the silence. "The $5,000 bonus cleared." "It did," he replied quietly. "I made sure of it myself. There was something unfamiliar in his voice. The dismissive superiority had disappeared. In its place sat cautious respect. "I appreciate it," I said. "It'll make a difference." He shifted slightly in his seat before speaking again. "Tyler hasn't left his room since Saturday. He canceled every training session he had scheduled. I kept my attention on the road. He'll recover. Pride usually heals faster than injuries." Another long pause settled inside the cabin. Finally, he asked the question he'd clearly been carrying since the party. "Who are you, Jack?" The words lingered between us. I answered without hesitation. "I'm the man you hired to drive your car and make sure nobody bothers you." "Our investigators looked into your background," Richard continued. "According to the report, you served in the Navy, honorable discharge, logistics, supply chain management." A faint smile almost reached my face. "The military has always been excellent at paperwork." He studied the back of my head through the mirror. "If Saturday changes things, I understand. If you want my resignation, I'll hand it to you. But I need this job." I didn't explain why. I didn't have to. Richard remained quiet for nearly a minute. Then he reached for his phone. Just before the call connected, he spoke almost to himself. "No, I think you're exactly where you're supposed to be." Later that afternoon, while Richard disappeared into a board meeting, I drove the Maybach to a children's hospital in New Haven. The transition always felt surreal. 1 hour you're surrounded by imported marble, tailored suits, and billion-dollar negotiations. The next you're walking across worn linoleum floors that smell faintly of antiseptic and quiet hope. Room 412, Sarah sat upright in bed with a paperback balanced across her knees. A small oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. Her copper-colored hair framed a face far too young to have spent so much time inside hospitals. The moment she looked up, everything changed. "Dad!" Her smile erased weeks of exhaustion. The weight I carried every day loosened, if only for a little while. I crossed the room carefully, mindful of the IV line running into her arm, and wrapped her in the gentlest hug I could manage. "Hey, kiddo, how are we doing today?" 98%. She practically glowed with pride. "Doctor, Evan says if tomorrow's treadmill test goes well, I can go home Thursday. That's incredible." From my coat pocket, I produced a small stuffed wolf I'd picked up downstairs in the gift shop. "A training partner for tomorrow." Her eyes lit up immediately. She brushed the soft fur with her fingertips. "I love him." "Thanks, Dad." She looked up curiously. "Were you working all weekend?" "Just another company party. Nothing exciting." It wasn't exactly a lie. For the next 2 hours, we talked about everything except hospitals. She told me about the fantasy novel she was reading. I listened while she described helping her mom plant flowers. We laughed over a television show we'd both been watching. Neither of us mentioned the scar running down the center of her chest. Neither of us needed to. As the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room, Saturday afternoon seemed impossibly far away. That mattered, not corporate retreats, not spoiled billionaires, not pride. This little girl breathing peacefully beside me, she was the reason I kept putting on the suit every morning. The $5,000 bonus had already been transferred directly toward her treatment. 3 more months of specialized therapy were now covered. Money couldn't erase fear, but it bought time. Sometimes time was everything. Before leaving, I kissed her forehead. "I'll call tonight. I know." She squeezed the stuffed wolf against her chest and smiled. "I love you. I love you too." Outside, the summer heat wrapped around me the moment I stepped into the parking structure. I slid behind the wheel of the armored Mercedes and rested both hands on the leather steering wheel. The silence returned. Only this time, it felt lighter. 3 weeks passed. Tyler became almost invisible inside his own home. Whenever our paths crossed in the kitchen or garage, he'd quietly turn around and disappear. The swagger had vanished. In its place remained bitterness and alcohol. More than once I caught the stale smell of vodka on him from across the room after he'd stumbled home long after midnight. He wasn't looking for another fight anymore. He was trying to convince himself he hadn't been broken. Unfortunately, he searched for that answer in exactly the wrong place. One rainy Tuesday evening, I sat inside the security office beside the garage watching perimeter cameras while working through a crossword puzzle. The intercom buzzed. "Jack." Richard's voice sounded different, not commanding. "Frayed my office now." I secured the monitoring system and crossed the quiet mansion toward the west wing. Richard's study smelled of leather, polished wood, and expensive scotch. He stood behind his desk looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. A thick piece of cardstock trembled slightly in one hand. A cheap burner phone rested on the desk beside it. "Close the door." I did. The heavy latch clicked shut. He removed his glasses and pressed both hands over his face. For several seconds he couldn't speak. Finally, "It's Tyler." Richard slowly lowered his hands from his face. For a long moment he simply stared at the desktop, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. "He's been disappearing into the city, underground poker games, high stakes. He thought he was playing against other rich kids." His voice cracked. "He wasn't." I stepped closer. Who was he gambling with? An Albanian crew? They operate out of a social club in Astoria. He kept signing markers. When they demanded payment, he dropped my name, thinking it would scare them. Richard let out a hollow laugh that carried no humor. He believed the family reputation would buy him time. It didn't. It only made him more valuable. I already knew how these situations worked. To organized crime, the son of a billionaire wasn't intimidating. He was leverage. "They have him," Richard whispered. His trembling finger pointed toward the burner phone lying on the desk. "They called 10 minutes ago. They sent a picture." I picked up the cheap phone. The cracked screens distorted the edges of the image. The center was painfully clear. Tyler sat bound to a folding chair inside a neglected room with peeling paint. One eye was swollen shut. His lips were split. Bruises covered most of his face. Fear had erased every trace of arrogance. "How much?" $2 million. "Cryptocurrency. They want it transferred through several wallets before tomorrow night." "You have the money," I replied evenly. "Pay them." Richard slammed his fist against the desk. "If I pay once, they'll own me forever. They'll keep coming, and if anyone finds out my son is being held by organized crime, the Vanguard merger dies. $10 billion disappears overnight. I can't involve the police. I can't involve the FBI. I can't let the board know." I placed the phone back where I'd found it. "Then you're dealing with a very expensive problem." Richard looked at me for several long seconds. The businessman and the father were fighting each other behind his eyes. The businessman was still winning. Finally, he stepped around the desk. "I watched you on that lawn. I saw what happened. You didn't just beat Tyler, you dismantled him." His voice lowered. "You're not a logistics officer. I don't know who you really were. And I don't care. I need someone who can solve this. Quietly, I drive your car, nothing more. I'll give you $500,000. The offer came almost too quickly. "Cash a wire, shell companies, whatever you want. Bring my son back before Thursday morning, and make sure those people never threaten my family again." $500,000. My mind didn't go to luxury. It went to Boston, to surgeons, to procedures insurance had refused to approve. Sarah. That amount could pay for the experimental valve replacement doctors believed would allow her to live a normal life. No more constant fear, no more wondering whether her heart would fail years before it should. I looked once more at the photograph. Tyler had made terrible decisions. He had treated people with contempt. He had tried to humiliate me. None of that meant he deserved to die tied to a chair. "I'll need an unregistered vehicle." My voice had already changed. It always did. "I need $50,000 immediately for operational expenses, and I want the complete audio recording of the ransom call." Richard exhaled heavily, relief mixed with desperation. "So you'll do it?" "If I bring your son home alive, I want one more condition." He nodded before I even finished. "Anything, if this goes wrong, if I don't come back, you establish a trust that covers every medical expense my daughter will ever have until she's 18. No loopholes, no delays. It gets funded tomorrow morning." Richard didn't hesitate. "You have my word. We have a deal." I turned toward the door. "Get the cash, find me a vehicle." The moment I stepped into the hallway, something inside me began to change. It wasn't excitement, it wasn't anger, it was familiarity. My pulse slowed, my breathing deepened, vision narrowed, 5 years disappeared. By the time I reached the small apartment above the garage, the civilian version of myself had already begun fading into the background. Inside my bedroom, I crossed to the closet and removed a concealed floor panel. Beneath it rested a heavy black Pelican case, exactly where I'd left it. Dust covered the lid. The locks clicked open. A familiar smell escaped immediately. Gun oil, metal, memories. Inside lay pieces of a life I'd sworn never to revisit. I didn't need everything. This wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a military operation. It was a recovery mission. Precision mattered more than firepower. I lifted out a customized Glock 19, Years of maintenance had kept it flawless. Doxtured grip, Mach-grade barrel, raised sights ready for a suppressor. I cycled the slides smooth, exactly as I remembered. 3 magazines followed, each loaded carefully. Next came the fixed blade knife I'd carried through deployments overseas. It settled against the small of my back beneath my shirt. The business suit came off. Black jeans replaced tailored slacks. Dark long-sleeve Henley replaced the dress shirt. Comfortable boots replaced polished shoes. I stood before the mirror. The quiet chauffeur had disappeared. Chief Petty Officer Jack Hayes stared back instead. The burner phone recording offered more information than the kidnappers realized. The regaled noise, parstitles most people ignored. An elevated train passed overhead at regular intervals. Heavy industrial machinery echoed somewhere nearby. I spread maps across the table, rail lines, industrial zoning, known Albanian territory. One by one the possibilities narrowed. 3 hours later I sat inside a stolen SUV parked half a block from an aging brick auto shop beneath elevated subway tracks in Astoria. 2 black BMWs waited beside the building, their rear suspensions sagged under extra weight. Weapons, equipment, additional cargo. Rain drifted through the empty street. A passing train thundered overhead. I checked the chamber, 1 round already loaded, the suppressor threaded smoothly onto the barrel. Hollywood gets this wrong. Suppressors don't make firearms silent. They simply reduce flash and change the sound. Combined with passing trains and industrial machinery, good enough. The front entrance was too exposed. Instead, I circled into a narrow alley. Reinforced steel side door blocked entry. Deadbolt engaged, no point wasting time. 10 feet above me, a ventilation fan spun steadily. I climbed the old brick wall using worn mortar joints as footholds. The protective grate came loose with 1 sharp pull. Rusted screws snapped free. I slipped through the opening and landed silently on an overhead catwalk. Below me, the shop came into view. Tyler sat exactly where the photograph had shown him. Only now, he looked even worse. His head hung forward, shoulders slumped against the restraints. The bruises had spread across most of his face since the photograph was taken. His breathing came in uneven pulls. He looked exhausted, broken. 3 men occupied the room. The first leaned casually against a battered toolbox with a short-barreled shotgun resting in his hands. Another sat at a folding table, methodically counting stacks of $100 bills. The third paced in slow circles before Tyler. He was broad-shouldered, heavily bearded, and wore a worn leather jacket that hung open over a dark shirt. "Your father has 2 hours," he said in heavily accented English. As he passed, he slapped Tyler across the side of the head. It wasn't meant to injure him. It was meant to humiliate him. Tyler flinched instinctively. "If the money doesn't arrive," the man crouched slightly, "I start with your fingers." His voice remained calm. "Then we move on." Tyler's composure collapsed. "I swear he'll pay. Please, just let me go." There wasn't any arrogance left, only fear. Watching him, I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't even feel pity. Emotion only clouds judgment in places like this. The mission came first, everything else waited. I evaluated the room, shotgun highest priority, leader second, cash counter third. A distant vibration rolled through the building. Another train approached overhead. I waited. The rumble grew louder until steel wheels drowned out every other sound. That was the moment. I stepped off the catwalk. The drop measured roughly 8 feet. I landed behind the rusted shell of an old vehicle, absorbing the impact without a sound. No warning, no commands, no hesitation. I rounded the chassis with my pistol already aligned. The man holding the shotgun never had time to react. 2 controlled shots struck center mass. He collapsed backward over the toolbox before the weapon slipped from his hands. The second man jerked his head toward the noise. His hand disappeared beneath his jacket. He never completed the motion. A single precise round ended the threat before his pistol cleared the holster. Loose bills scattered across the tabletop as he fell forward. The bearded leader spun toward me, drawing a large revolver. He reacted quickly, not quickly enough. His shot echoed violently through the shop, the unsuppressed blast ricocheting off concrete walls. Brick exploded a few feet to my left. I never stopped advancing. 1 carefully placed shot struck his right shoulder. The revolver flew from his grasp. He staggered backward with a cry of pain. Before he could recover, I was already inside his reach. The Glock disappeared back into its holster. My left hand seized the front of his jacket. My right leg swept beneath him. His balance vanished. He crashed heavily onto the stained concrete. I dropped beside him, driving my knee firmly into his injured shoulder to pin him in place. The combat knife came free in one smooth motion. Its edge rested lightly against the side of his neck. The entire encounter, 4 seconds, maybe a little less, his breathing turned shallow, his eyes locked onto mine. He expected questions, negotiation, bargaining. Instead, I spoke quietly. "Who else knows about the kidnapping?" His lips trembled. "No one. Only us." I applied slightly more pressure. "Think carefully. We grabbed him ourselves. No bosses, no partners, no one else. I swear." A thin line of blood appeared beneath the blade. I studied him for another moment. Years overseas had taught me to recognize desperation. He wasn't lying. I eased the pressure just enough for him to breathe comfortably. "Your crew is finished." My voice remained almost conversational. "If you ever come near the Cole family again, if you ever mention their name, I'll find you." He nodded immediately. I understand. I slid the knife back into its sheath and stood. His revolver lay a few feet away. I kicked it beneath an abandoned engine block. "Stay exactly where you are for the next 10 minutes. If I see you standing before then, I come back." He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. I turned away and walked toward Tyler. He stared at the 2 motionless men across the room. Then at me. Recognition slowly appeared in his eyes. Not recognition of the chauffeur. Recognition of the man beneath the suit. The quiet employee who opened car doors each morning no longer existed. Standing before him was someone entirely different. Someone he had never imagined. I unfolded a pocket knife and cut through the restraints, binding his wrists and ankles. His arms dropped limply to his sides. Circulation returned in painful waves. He nearly collapsed before catching himself. "Jack," his voice barely carried. "Is that really you?" I grabbed his jacket and pulled him upright. "We're leaving." Nothing more needed to be said. Supporting most of his weight, I guided him toward the reinforced side entrance, released the deadbolt, and pushed the door open. Cold rain met us immediately. Tyler stumbled into the alley before doubling over against the brick wall. He vomited violently. I remained beside him, scanning both ends of the street while my hand rested near my holstered pistol. Only after several moments did he straighten enough to breathe. He looked at me with hollow eyes. "You," his voice shook. "You killed them." I met his gaze without emotion. "I brought you home alive. That's the only part that matters." He lowered his head. Every trace of pride had disappeared. "Get in the vehicle." He obeyed without another word. As I settled behind the wheel of the stolen SUV, the adrenaline finally began to fade. The familiar ache returned to my knee. Fatigue settled into my shoulders. In the rearview mirror, Tyler sat curled against the corner of the back seat, staring silently through the rain-streaked window. He wasn't the same young man who had mocked the chauffeur beside the catering tent. The illusion he'd built around himself had collapsed. He had finally seen the difference between sport and survival. I shifted to drive and eased the SUV into the darkness, leaving the warehouse behind. The tires whispered across the rain-soaked pavement as we pulled away from Astoria. A steady drizzle blurred the windshield while the heater pushed warm air through the cabin. Even so, Tyler couldn't stop shaking. From the passenger seat, he stared silently at his bruised hands, his breathing uneven and shallow. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing I could say that would erase what he'd just witnessed. And honestly, he didn't need comfort, he needed perspective. For years, he'd mistaken controlled competition for genuine danger. He'd confused padded mats with real consequences. Tonight, he'd stepped into a world where there were no referees, no time limits, and no guarantees. The lesson had cost him almost everything. At 3:45 that morning, the SUV rolled through the wrought iron gates of the Cole estate. The mansion stood almost completely dark, except for the warm glow spilling from Richard Cole's study. I shut off the engine and stepped into the cool night air. Tyler reached for the passenger door, but his hands trembled so badly he couldn't even work the handle. I walked around, opened it for him, and stepped aside. He climbed out slowly, his legs barely supporting him. Before we reached the front entrance, the heavy oak doors swung open. Richard Cole stood in the doorway. He was still wearing yesterday's suit. His tie was gone, the collar hung open. Fatigue had carved deep lines across his face. For a brief second he looked past me, then his eyes found Tyler. Tyler, the word escaped him like a prayer. Tyler didn't answer. He simply staggered forward and collapsed into his father's arms. Richard held him tightly, pressing his forehead against his son's battered hair. In that moment he wasn't one of the most powerful businessmen in America. He wasn't negotiating billion-dollar mergers. He wasn't calculating profit margins. He was only a father who had nearly lost his child. I quietly walked past them. Their reunion belonged to them. Mine did not. Mud from my boots marked the polished marble floor as I made my way toward the study. A few minutes later, Richard entered and closed the door behind him. Without speaking, he crossed to an antique globe that concealed a liquor cabinet. He poured 2 generous glasses of scotch. One he offered to me. I left it untouched. He placed it carefully on the edge of the desk instead. He's upstairs. The doctor is with him. He told me what happened. He told you what he believes happened. I replied calmly. Richard looked at me for a long time. He said you killed them. I eliminated the threats preventing your son's return. That was our agreement. He swallowed hard. The police, they won't receive a report. I interrupted before he could finish. The men holding Tyler were operating outside their own organization. If their superiors discover what they were doing, they'll clean up the situation themselves. The warehouse will be empty before sunrise. This ends tonight. Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair. He studied me as though he were seeing 2 different men standing in the same room, the quiet chauffeur, and someone else entirely. Finally, he opened the top drawer of his desk and removed an iPad. After tapping the screen several times, he slid it toward me. The trust. His voice was barely above a whisper. $500,000 has already been transferred. The funds went directly to the Boston Pediatric Surgical Group. Everything cleared, surgery, recovery, additional expenses, it's all covered. I picked up the tablet, write every confirmation number, every transfer receipt, every authorization. For the first time since Sarah entered this world, the weight I'd carried inside my chest finally began to lift. A slow breath escaped before I even realized I'd been holding it. Thank you, Richard shook his head. No, you saved my son. You should be thanking yourself. He leaned back, exhausted. Take the rest of the week. Go be with your daughter. I placed the tablet back onto the desk. I'll see you Monday morning, Mr. Cole. Without another word, I turned and left the room. 4 days later, I sat inside a brightly lit waiting room in Boston. Everything smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. I wore jeans and a gray sweater instead of a suit. Both hands rested quietly on my knees. The familiar calluses beneath my thumbs reminded me of another lifetime. The double doors opened. A surgeon stepped into the hallway, lowering his mask as he approached. Mr. Hayes? I stood immediately, his tired expression softened into a genuine smile. The procedure was a success. Every muscle in my body relaxed at once. The replacement valve is functioning perfectly. Blood flow looks excellent. She's in recovery now. You'll be able to see her shortly. My legs suddenly felt unsteady. When can she come home? If everything continues this way, about a week. He smiled again. After that, she'll be able to live like any other healthy little girl. I thanked him, but I barely remember saying the words. Once he walked away, I lowered myself back into the chair. My elbows rested on my knees. For years, I'd carried everything alone, the deployments, the memories, the guilt, the fear. I buried my face in my hands. The operator was finally gone. The mission had ended. For the first time in 5 years, I allowed myself to cry. The following Monday, August greeted Connecticut with another wave of thick humidity. I stood beside the armored Mercedes Maybach wearing the same inexpensive black suit, a freshly pressed white shirt, and a neatly knotted dark tie. My shoes reflected the morning sun, and the engine purred so quietly it was almost impossible to hear. The front doors of the estate opened. Tyler stepped outside. The bruises covering his face had faded into shades of yellow and green. But the real transformation had nothing to do with healing skin. His posture had changed. The swagger that once announced his arrival had vanished completely. His shoulders sat lower. His movements were careful, measured. He carried a large black trash bag toward the industrial dumpster beside the garage. As he lifted it over the edge, the opening briefly revealed what was inside: a pair of padded MMA gloves, several pieces of foam training equipment. The edge of one of the mats, he wasn't storing them, he was throwing them away. When he turned, our eyes met. He froze. For a heartbeat, the color drained from his face. He wasn't looking at the chauffeur standing beside the Maybach. He was back inside that warehouse, back beneath the rumbling train tracks, back in the room where illusion collided with reality. Whatever confidence had once fueled his arrogance was gone forever. Without speaking, he slowly lowered his head. It wasn't fear alone, it was respect, the kind earned only after someone discovers how little they truly understand. He said nothing. He simply turned and disappeared back into the house. A minute later, Richard Cole emerged. Everything about him looked familiar again. Tailored navy suit, pond pressed against his ear, sharp, decisive instructions flowing through another high-stakes business conversation. The billion-dollar merger was finally closing. The corporate machine had resumed exactly where it had left off. I stepped forward and opened the rear passenger door. Richard paused before getting inside. He looked directly at me. The expression in his eyes was no longer one of ownership. Nor was it gratitude, it was understanding. The quiet man opening his car door each morning was also the most capable protector he had ever known. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," I said. He gave a small nod. "Good morning, Jack." Nothing more. He settled into the leather seat. I closed the door gently, walked around the rear of the car, and took my place behind the wheel. The Maybach rolled smoothly down the long, winding driveway. In the rearview mirror, Richard was already back on his phone, negotiating, directing, building empires. Some things never change. I returned my attention to the road. Miles away, Sarah's heart now beat with the steady strength every father hopes to hear. That was enough, more than enough. The city swallowed the car into its morning traffic. Another anonymous luxury sedan, another invisible driver, exactly the way I preferred it. People often mistake confidence for capability. They confuse expensive training with real experience. A belt can measure dedication. It cannot measure what someone has survived. True protectors rarely advertise themselves. They don't need applause, they don't need recognition, and they certainly don't need a black belt to prove what they're capable of. I guided the Maybach through the flow of traffic, quiet and unnoticed once again, invisible exactly where I belonged.